November 20th, 1943, 0541 hours, Betio Island, Tarawa Atoll. In the cramped darkness of his reinforced command bunker, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki lowered his binoculars and felt the concrete beneath his boots tremble. Beyond the narrow observation slit, the pre-dawn horizon was erupting into sheets of flame as American battleships opened fire. The night sky over Betio flickered and flashed, but Shibazaki remained convinced. The storm breaking over his island would not be enough. It would take, he had once declared, 1,000,000 men 100 years to conquer Tarawa. His confidence did not come from bravado alone. The bunker he stood in was buried under roughly 10 feet of coral sand and coconut logs, its walls a solid mass of reinforced concrete. Above him, tons of compacted coral, palm wood, and steel formed a lid designed to shrug off anything modern naval guns could throw at it. Through that narrow observation slit, he surveyed what he believed to be the ultimate expression of Japanese defensive engineering. An entire island transformed into a single fortress. Betio measured less than half a square mile, about 3,800 yards long and 600 yards at its widest point, with a maximum elevation of roughly 10 feet above sea level. A speck of coral in the vast Central Pacific, smaller than New York's Central Park, had been turned into one of the most heavily fortified positions in modern military history. On that tiny strip of land, some 4,500 men of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Special Naval Landing Forces, elite naval infantry, often described as Imperial Marines, waited in positions that had taken 15 months to prepare. Nothing had been left to chance. Every sector of beach had been measured, every likely landing point registered for artillery, every angle calculated so that machine guns and cannon overlapped in carefully constructed interlocking fields of fire. No stretch of shoreline existed where an attacker could stand without being under direct observation and aimed fire. Since September 1942, Japanese engineers, assisted by Korean laborers forced into service, had turned the atoll into something unprecedented. Betio was no longer just an island. It was a single, integrated defensive system. The numbers barely seemed believable. Over 100 major pillboxes and bunkers had been constructed, interconnected by trenches and communication tunnels. 14 coastal defense guns ringed the shores, including 4 8-inch Vickers naval rifles purchased from Britain back in 1905, now resurrected to face a new enemy. 40 field artillery pieces had been emplaced to cover the lagoon and beaches. More than 200 machine gun positions were arranged so that each protected the others, creating a lattice of fire that left no dead space along any beach. The construction of these defenses represented a brutal kind of craftsmanship. Many of the main bunkers were built with reinforced concrete walls up to 5 feet thick, the mix strengthened with crushed coral that actually made it harder and more resilient than standard concrete. Over these concrete shells, thick coconut trunks and palm wood beams, some logs as much as 18 inches in diameter, formed a second protective layer. The palm timber, so dense it would not even float, could soak up tremendous explosive energy before breaking. Old railroad rails, shipped at great expense from Japan, were embedded into many structures, creating internal skeletons that could resist direct hits. Over everything, engineers heaped layers of sand and coral, 10 to 12 feet deep in places, which absorbed blast shock more effectively than almost any modern building material. Where concrete and steel would crack and spall under heavy bombardment, this combination of coral, logs, and sand simply swallowed the explosions. Mixed into the complex were hexagonal steel pillboxes, some dating back to the era of the Russo-Japanese War, repurposed and embedded into new defensive lines. These odd, angular structures, combined with the modern concrete fortifications, produced a dense, overlapping network of firing positions that could endure punishment and continue fighting. Shibazaki believed he stood at the center of a masterpiece. The Americans approaching this fortress believed they were about to crush it under overwhelming firepower. November 19, 1943, USS Maryland, 125 miles southwest of Tarawa. On the deck of the battleship, Major Michael P. Ryan of the United States Marine Corps looked out across the sea and saw the greatest amphibious assault force yet assembled by the United States in the Pacific War. Warships and transports stretched to the horizon in all directions, a floating city of steel and gray paint rolling slowly toward the Gilbert Islands. 17 aircraft carriers, 12 battleships, 8 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, 66 destroyers. 36 transports carried the 2nd Marine Division, veterans of Guadalcanal who believed they had already experienced the worst the Japanese could inflict. As they smoked, joked, and checked their gear for the 100th time, most of them assumed that whatever awaited them ashore could not be worse than what they had already survived. They were wrong. The intelligence briefings had sounded reassuring. Aerial photographs showed a small island bristling with guns and bunkers, but the Navy's planners were confident. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, in charge of the amphibious force, had told the Marines that the naval bombardment would be so thorough they would be able to practically walk ashore unopposed. The fire plan seemed to support that optimism. In just 3 hours, American battleships, cruisers, and destroyers were scheduled to unload thousands of heavy shells onto Betio, more explosive power concentrated on a single target than in any previous Pacific operation. Carrier aircraft would add their bombs, shredding any positions that somehow survived the naval guns. On paper, nothing could live under such a storm. But not Colonel David Shoup, who would command the landing forces in the assault waves, had spent long hours hunched over aerial photographs, studying every bunker shadow and trench line until his eyes burned. The defenses, he realized, were not simply strong. They were mathematically arranged. Someone on the Japanese side had designed this island with a cold, geometric understanding of defensive warfare. Fields of fire, arcs of observation, interlocking positions. The pattern was too precise to be accidental. Another concern gnawed at a small number of officers: the tides. Betio was ringed by a coral reef. For the American Higgins boats, shallow draft landing craft loaded with Marines, to pass safely over the reef and into the lagoon, planners calculated they needed a tide of about 5 feet. The Navy's tide experts, confident in their charts and tables, assured everyone that the necessary depth would be there. Major Frank Holland, a New Zealander who had lived in the Gilbert Islands for 15 years, said otherwise. He warned of the dodging tide, a neap tide phenomenon that could leave the reef unexpectedly shallow. He insisted that, at certain phases of the moon, the water might never rise high enough for loaded landing craft to clear the coral. His warnings were politely noted, and largely dismissed. The experts, with their neat calculations, declared that the water would be deep enough. The Marines would soon discover which side was right. November 20th, 1943, 05:05 hours. The bombardment began when Maryland's 16-inch guns spoke for the first time that morning. The shock of the opening salvo rolled down the battleship's length, and moments later enormous geysers of flame and smoke erupted over Betio. Within minutes, the pre-dawn darkness was torn away, replaced by a harsh, flickering daylight, created by hundreds of guns firing simultaneously. From transport ships anchored roughly 10 miles offshore, Marines crowded the rails and watched what looked like the destruction of an entire island. Battleships, Colorado and Maryland, hurled hundreds of 16-inch shells. Tennessee's 14-inch guns added their thunder. Cruisers contributed thousands of 6-inch shells in fast succession, while destroyers poured in smaller caliber fire until their barrels glowed red. The sky above Betio became a boiling column of smoke and dust that climbed thousands of feet into the air. The line of palm trees along the shore vanished in the haze. From 30 miles away, ships could see the enormous cloud rising like a volcanic eruption over Tarawa. At 05:42, carrier aircraft joined the assault. Dive bombers peeled off from altitude, their sirens wailing, and released bombs in carefully planned patterns over marked Japanese positions. Torpedo bombers, repurposed as level bombers for this mission, followed with their own loads. From a distance, it appeared that no structure could possibly survive. Yet, inside his bunker, Shibazaki felt something different. The bunker shook, dust drifted from the overhead, and concussion thumped through the underground chambers, but his command post remained intact. So did most of his island. Through the smoke, American naval spotters began to notice details that didn't fit the reassuring narrative of total destruction. The big 8-inch coastal guns continued to fire. Anti-aircraft positions were still active, sending bursts of tracers and flak into the paths of attacking planes. As the haze shifted and thinned in places, the outlines of bunkers and pillboxes could still be seen, solid and unchanged, like stone monuments enduring a storm. After the battle, the after-action reports would quantify the disaster. Out of more than 100 major defensive positions on Baitio, the 3-hour bombardment had completely destroyed just 4. Thousands of shells had indeed fallen on the island, but spread over 291 acres, they had delivered comparatively little concentrated force onto any single hardened point. Each bunker, no larger than a small house, needed a direct hit from a heavy shell to be neutralized. Most never received one. The coral sand absorbed enormous amounts of blast energy. The coconut logs and palm wood layers flexed and splintered, but did not simply shatter. The result was deceptively simple. The island's fortifications looked battered and scorched, but they were still there, still manned, and still ready. The Marines watching from their distant ships could not yet see that reality. To many of them, it looked as if nothing on Baitio could possibly be left alive. They would learn the truth when they tried to land. November 20th, 1943, 06:30 hours. Far out from Baitio's northern beaches, the sea looked deceptively calm. Beneath the surface, however, the coral reef waited. Hard, jagged, and shallower than American planning had assumed. The Navy's experts had promised 5 feet of water across the reef. Major Holland had insisted it would not be enough for fully loaded Higgins boats, which needed about 4 feet of depth to clear the coral. In the end, reality was worse than either side had anticipated. On that crucial morning, the tide over the reef was roughly 3 feet, not the 18 inches some later stories would incorrectly claim, but still critically shallow. It was not enough. At 0700 hours, the first wave of landing craft approached the pale line of surf, where deep lagoon water met the reef. Marines inside the Higgins boats gripped their rifles and packs, bracing for the ramp to clang down into knee-deep surf and the rush toward the sand. Instead, many heard the grinding sound of steel scraping coral. Their boats stopped. One after another, the Higgins boats in the later waves ran aground on the reef, some 500 to 800 yards from the shore. Engines roared, propellers churned, hulls shuddered, but the boats would go no farther. The dodging tide that Holland had warned about had trapped them in water too shallow to cross and too deep to wade easily. Only the first 3 assault waves had been equipped with amphibious tractors, LVTs, nicknamed alligators. There were just 125 of these tracked vehicles available, enough to carry roughly 1,500 men. Designed to crawl over reefs, they were the only craft capable of moving directly from ship to beach that morning. For everyone else, the options shrank to one brutal necessity. Marines in the stranded Higgins boats slung their weapons, tightened the straps of their packs, about 60 pounds of gear and ammunition, and climbed over the sides into the lagoon. Ahead of them lay hundreds of yards of shallow, clear water, an exposed walk through a killing zone that the bombardment had scarcely touched. November 20th, 1943, 07:55 hours. As the first LVTs clattered and splashed over the reef and into the lagoon, the Japanese defense system, meticulously prepared over 15 months, came to life. Shibazaki's gunners had spent months calculating distances and angles. Every likely approach route across the lagoon had been measured and pre-registered. As the amphibious tractors moved forward, they entered zones where artillery, mortars, and machine guns could converge their fire with mathematical precision. From concealed positions behind coconut log walls and within concrete casemates, Japanese gunners opened up. Shells began to walk along the routes the vehicles were forced to follow, plunging into the shallow water with terrifying accuracy. Mortar rounds bracketed the LVTs, machine gun streams stitched across the lagoon, seeking out moving shapes. Many of the LVTs burned or sank before they ever reached the beach. Those that survived the journey across the reef faced another unseen element of the island's defense: the seawall. Running along the lagoon side of Betio's northern beaches, a barrier of coconut logs between 3 and 5 feet high offered the only significant cover on the open sand. To the Marines who reached it, exhausted and stunned, it would seem like salvation, something solid to crouch against while they caught their breath. But the seawall had been designed into the Japanese defense, not against it. Shibazaki's engineers had placed their bunkers to fire parallel to the wall, not straight out toward the sea. Machine guns and rifles were positioned to sweep along the length of the logs, sending bullets skimming just inches above the sand where Marines would instinctively huddle. What looked like shelter was, in fact, a trap. The first hour's losses among the amphibious tractors told the story. Out of 125 LVTs used in the initial waves, about 90 were destroyed or disabled. The plan that relied on them to carry subsequent waves to shore quickly broke down. The interlocking fields of fire, rifles, machine guns, mortars, artillery, were functioning exactly as intended. And behind the burning wrecks, thousands of Marines were now in the water. November 20th, 1943, 8:30 hours. The 4th, 5th, and 6th assault waves encountered not a beach, but the full horror of an amphibious landing against a perfectly prepared defense. With their Higgins boats stranded on the reef, approximately 3,500 Marines began the long wade toward the island. The distance from the reef's edge to the seawall was roughly 700 yards. The lagoon bottom rose and fell with coral humps and channels, so the depth of the water varied from waist-high to up near a man's neck. Every Marine carried roughly 60 pounds of equipment: rifle, ammunition, grenades, entrenching tool, canteen, personal gear. Moving through chest-deep water with that load turned any attempt at running into a slow, staggering walk. The Japanese had anticipated this exact scenario. Mortar crews had pre-registered their tubes on the reef line, knowing that boats aground there would disgorge men into the water. Machine gun nests were positioned to rake the lagoon in overlapping arcs. From bunkers effectively untouched by the bombardment, gunners looked through carefully aligned sights and fired at shapes struggling through the clear water. The lagoon's tropical clarity worked against the attackers. There was no murk to hide in, no surf to break the outline of a man. Each figure stood out sharply against the pale coral bottom. At the slow pace forced by the water, an average Marine made that crossing in about 35 minutes. That meant 35 minutes under aimed fire. Casualties rose with grim, mechanical regularity. Entire squads disappeared before reaching the halfway mark. Men hit once went under, surfaced choking, then were struck again. The weight of gear that had been manageable on deck turned lethal in the lagoon. Wounded Marines who lost consciousness or the ability to kick and push themselves forward simply sank. Some drowned in water barely 3 feet deep. The horror multiplied. Blood in the water spread in long veils behind the struggling lines of men. Sharks, drawn by instinct to the scent of blood and the thrashing movement, began to appear. For Marines already under fire and fighting the drag of their equipment, the sight of dorsal fins cutting through the water added a nightmare element to an already unbearable passage. Still, they kept moving. November 20th, 1943, 09:15 hours. For those who made it, the seawall offered the first chance to press their bodies against something solid and breathe. But the respite was short and illusory. Along the accessible length of the coconut log barrier, perhaps 500 men could find some kind of cover. By 09:30, roughly 3 times that number were trying to cram themselves into that space, with more Marines wading ashore every minute. Those who could not squeeze into a shallow depression or slot between logs had no choice but to lie exposed in the open sand or remain in the shallow water just offshore. Now the true brilliance and cruelty of the Japanese defensive layout revealed itself. A single bunker, placed at just the right angle, could fire along hundreds of yards of seawall. Guns at different heights allowed Japanese crews to shoot over the heads of the Marines nearest the logs and hit those packed in behind them. From other positions, machine gun streams and rifle fire crossed at low angles, turning the narrow strip behind the wall into a target zone. Mortars, carefully pre-registered, did not need to see their victims. Crews had the ranges already set. They simply dropped rounds into their tubes and sent shells arcing blindly into the area behind the seawall where they knew Marines would gather. Explosions walked up and down the line of prone men, tearing gaps that were immediately filled by more Marines crawling into what little shelter existed. The geometry was uncompromising. The seawall gave perhaps 18 inches of protection for those pressed directly against it. Any attempt to move, to stand, to organize for an attack inland meant exposure to dozens of firing points. Survival in that strip of sand depended less on skill and more on pure chance. Who happened to be in the wrong place when a mortar shell landed or a machine gun team swung their weapon? November 20th, 1943, 10:30 hours. Colonel David Shoup's own landing craft never reached the shore. It was hit and destroyed about 500 yards out, forcing him and his staff to wade through the same fire-swept lagoon as the men he commanded. Somewhere in that crossing, shrapnel tore into his leg, but he remained on his feet, pushing forward through the water. Reaching the seawall, bleeding but still mobile, Shoup established a makeshift command post pressed against the logs. Around him, the situation was close to catastrophic. Of the roughly 3,500 Marines who had attempted to land in the first 2 hours of the assault, about 1,500 were already casualties, dead, wounded, or missing in the lagoon. The survivors held a fragile foothold along about 700 yards of beach. Their deepest penetration inland measured perhaps 20 yards. Shoup studied the layout of the enemy fire, the positions he could see on the island, and the pattern of casualties. In that chaos, he recognized something crucial. The Japanese defense was nearly perfect. Nearly. Its strength lay in the interlocking nature of its bunkers and firing points. Every gun supported others, but that same interdependence created a weakness. If even a single key position could be destroyed, the carefully overlapping fields of fire would develop a gap. That gap could be exploited to assault other positions from angles the Japanese had not fortified. The system depended on every major point continuing to fire. The removal of one would begin a chain reaction. The defense's greatest strength contained within it the seeds of its destruction. With radios largely wrecked by seawater and enemy fire, communications were ragged. Over unreliable sets and by word of mouth, Shoup issued the orders that would define the battle. There would be no withdrawal, no pause to reorganize on the reef, no attempt to pull the Marines back to the ships. The attack would continue regardless of casualties. The only way off that beach, Shoup decided, was forward, through the fortress that Shibazaki believed to be impregnable. November 20th, 1943, 1100 hours. The turning of the battle did not begin with neat, coordinated maneuvers. It began with small groups of men who decided, on their own initiative, to move toward the guns instead of staying pinned behind the seawall. Military doctrine warned that attacking fortified positions across open ground under observed fire was almost suicidal. At Tarawa, some Marines did it anyway. First Lieutenant William Dean Hawkins, commander of the 2nd Marine Division's Scout Sniper Platoon, quickly realized that simply lying still behind the seawall meant being slowly ground to pieces. Gathering a handful of volunteers, he led a series of attacks against Japanese positions dominating the beach. Using grenades, demolition charges, and accurate rifle fire, Hawkins and his men maneuvered across sand swept by machine guns and mortars. Position by position, they stalked bunkers that had seemed invulnerable from the water. Some they approached from blind angles where the Japanese had not expected an attack. Others they assaulted head-on, trading casualties for progress. By the time he was mortally wounded on November 21st, Hawkins had personally destroyed or neutralized 6 enemy positions, creating precious openings in the defensive network. Staff Sergeant William J. Borderon, already wounded several times, refused to be evacuated. On November 20th, he advanced alone with demolition charges against 2 machine gun nests that were tearing into Marines clustered along the seawall. He destroyed both positions before being killed while attacking a third. His sacrifice silenced a strong point that had inflicted devastating losses on the men trying to organize for a push inland. First Lieutenant Alexander Bonian Jr., a combat engineer who had given up a successful civilian business to enlist, would lead one of the most crucial assaults of the battle. On November 22nd, he took charge of the attack on the largest Japanese defensive position on Baitio, a massive bomb-proof shelter that served as a major command and control center. Under a storm of enemy fire, Bonian led Marines up the sandy slope that concealed the bunker. Reaching the crest, he stood fully exposed, firing down into the openings while his men brought up explosives. He held that position until a burst of machine gun fire killed him. His actions, however, allowed engineers to place demolition charges that ultimately destroyed the strong point. These men did not change the battlefield with intricate plans. They changed it by repeatedly doing the one thing the Japanese had not fully accounted for, attacking anyway. November 20th, 1943, 1400 hours. Inside the surviving Japanese bunkers, a grim realization began to spread. The Americans were not reacting to casualties the way theory predicted. Military planners generally assumed that a unit suffering around 30% casualties would stop functioning effectively as a cohesive force. At 50% losses, doctrine suggested that most formations would cease to operate as viable combat units. On Baitio, Marine companies and platoons that had taken casualties at or above those levels were still advancing. Bleeding, fragmented, often led by junior NCOs or privates after officers fell, they continued to move through the killing zones. Japanese defensive planning had relied on the assumption that no rational attacker would sustain high losses for a piece of land so small. That calculation had seemed solid on paper. Yet the Americans were refusing to behave according to the math. The geometry of the defense, its interlocking fields of fire, its mutually supporting bunkers, had been constructed to break any enemy that obeyed conventional limits. But the defense had a vulnerability that the Japanese had not fully reckoned with: the will of the attackers. Each bunker destroyed by individual acts of courage created a gap in the pattern of fire. Each gap allowed a few more Marines to move farther inland. Those Marines, in turn, could attack other positions from angles the Japanese had not reinforced. With each position that fell, the entire network became weaker. What had been designed as a closed, perfect system started to unravel. November 20th, 1943, 1600 hours. By late afternoon, the rising tide finally brought the water in the lagoon higher, though not high enough to erase the day's damage. Some landing craft could now get closer to the beaches without grounding on the reef. A handful managed to reach the shore directly, bringing in additional reinforcements, ammunition, and critical supplies. The beach that had been a nearly pure killing ground just 6 hours earlier was now a chaotic but functioning landing zone. Wrecked LVTs and burnt-out boats lay at odd angles. Bodies, gear, and shattered equipment littered the sand. Under continuing Japanese fire, Marines dragged in wounded, stacked ammunition and tried to carve out some semblance of order. Most radios had failed, soaked with salt water during the wade, smashed by shrapnel, or destroyed along with their operators. Colonel Shoup continued to command from his position near the seawall, but the fragile command network now depended on runners. Marines who volunteered to carry messages across ground, swept by snipers, machine guns, and mortar fire. The mortality rate among these runners was appalling. Many did not make it from one position to the next, yet replacements kept stepping forward, taking folded scraps of paper or memorized orders and sprinting into the danger. Their willingness to cross that space allowed Shoup to coordinate scattered units, redirect fire, and keep pressure on key points of the Japanese line. Progress was measured in yards gained. 10 yards here, 15 there. A single bunker knocked out could free a stretch of beach. A trench line cleared might allow a handful more men to move inland. Where Japanese tacticians had calculated casualty ratios and lines of sight, Marines responded with something that could not be quantified easily: stubbornness. What had begun the day as an almost perfect defensive setup was now under constant grinding pressure. November 20th, 1943, 2100 hours. By the time darkness fell on the first day, approximately 5,000 Marines had attempted to land on Betio. More than 1,500 of them were casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. Yet the survivors held a tenuous foothold on the island. It was far from secure. Japanese artillery and mortars were still active. Snipers and machine gun teams remained in concealed positions. But the central question had been answered. Shibazaki's fortress could be breached. Night brought its own set of dangers. Japanese forces were well trained in night operations and infiltration tactics. Marines, exhausted and scattered into mixed groups, many serving alongside men from units other than their own, prepared for the classic response they had been warned about: a massive, screaming banzai charge designed to sweep them back into the sea. That attack never came. Instead, Japanese units launched a series of smaller probing assaults, trying to infiltrate Marine lines, test for weak spots, and create confusion. Short, sharp firefights flared in the darkness as Marines fired at sudden movements and silhouettes. The knowledge that the enemy might be crawling just yards away kept tension high along the flimsy defensive perimeter. Colonel Shoup, aware that daylight would bring renewed assaults, ordered his men to improve their positions as best they could. Foxholes were scraped out behind the seawall. Machine gun and rifle fields of fire were adjusted, as much by instinct as by calculation. Small patrols edged forward into the darkness to identify enemy positions and potential approaches for the next day's attacks. As the night wore on, one more lesson emerged from the chaos. The Japanese, formidable when fighting from their carefully built fortifications, were less dominant in the fluid, uncertain combat of darkness. Without the full advantage of prepared positions, their superiority in defensive planning diminished. The first day at Tarawa had been a bloodbath. The second day would decide whether those losses had been paid in vain or had purchased a foothold that could not be dislodged. November 21st, 1943, 0600 hours. With the dawn of the second day, the full cost of the previous 24 hours became visible. The lagoon was still dotted with wrecked amphibious tractors and boats. The beaches were strewn with abandoned equipment and the dead of both sides. Smoke drifted over the island in patches, revealing and concealing the low silhouettes of bunkers and shattered palm trees. During the night, additional Marine units had fought their way ashore. By sunrise, roughly 7,000 Americans were now on Betio. They faced Japanese defenders who had already lost an estimated 1,000 men, but still held many of their strongest positions. On Betio's western shore lay Green Beach, a stretch of sand less heavily defended than the northern landing areas that had borne the brunt of the first day's assault. Major Michael P. Ryan led a key operation there. His forces landed with significantly fewer casualties than those on the northern beaches and immediately turned east, moving along the length of the island rather than directly inland. This maneuver threatened Japanese positions from flank and rear angles they had not expected to defend. The intricate pattern of bunkers and firing lines, designed primarily to resist assaults from the seaward side, was now being attacked from behind. Meanwhile, the Marines as a whole had already begun adapting, in the space of a few brutal hours, to the realities of attacking Japanese fortifications. Bunkers, they learned, could not be reduced by small arms alone. Each position required a tailored combination of tools: direct tank fire, flamethrowers, demolition charges, and infantry support. Sherman tanks, which had struggled to get ashore through the chaos of the first day, finally began to appear in useful numbers. Their 75mm guns, firing at close range, could punch into embrasures and crack log and coral structures that had shrugged off naval bombardment. Combat engineers brought up explosive satchel charges and Bangalore torpedoes. Riflemen and machine gunners provided covering fire as small teams crawled forward to plant explosives against bunker walls. The process was methodical and cruel. Suppress the position. Close the distance. Place explosives. Detonate. Then move to the next one. The Japanese defenders fought back with fanatic determination, often fighting to the last man inside each bunker, but the systematic reduction had begun. November 21st, 1943, 1400 hours. Near the center of the island stood the largest defensive structure on Betio, Admiral Shibazaki's main command bunker. Constructed with walls up to 5 feet thick and buried under tons of sand and coral, it contained multiple firing positions and underground chambers capable of holding some 300 men. Taking this bunker would require everything the Marines could bring to bear. Sherman tanks rolled forward first, grinding over craters and debris to reach point-blank range. From just yards away, they fired directly into apertures and firing slits, blasting chunks from the front of the structure. Marines with rifles and light machine guns poured suppressing fire into every visible opening, trying to keep defenders from returning accurate fire. Engineers, burdened with large demolition charges, rushed forward under this cover. They hurled satchel charges into doorways and vent openings, then dove for what little shelter they could find as explosions shook the bunker. Some charges damaged external features but failed to penetrate the main interior. Realizing that explosives alone might not be enough, the Marines employed a grimly effective alternative. Bulldozers, brought ashore under fire, were driven up close to the bunker. Their blades pushed sand and coral against entrances and air vents, gradually sealing them. The bunker that had been designed to survive anything from the outside was being suffocated. The final step came with gasoline. Hundreds of gallons were poured into ventilation shafts and buried openings. When the fuel had seeped into the depths of the structure, Marines ignited it. The resulting explosion and fire roared through the underground chambers, consuming oxygen and inhabitants alike. The heat and smoke were intense enough to kill the estimated 300 defenders trapped inside. Admiral Shibazaki almost certainly died in this inferno, though his body was never definitively identified among the burned remains. With the destruction of the main command bunker, the symbolic heart of Betio's defense was ripped out. The fortress was still dangerous, but its central control point was gone. November 21st, 1943, 1630 hours. That afternoon, Marines captured Betio's airfield, the primary strategic objective of the entire operation. The runway, damaged but usable, now lay within American lines and would soon be repaired to support operations across the Central Pacific. The Japanese had devoted enormous effort to protecting this airfield, concentrating fortifications around it. They had assumed that any attacker would focus his efforts directly on that vital piece of ground. Their defensive plan anticipated a relentless push for the runway above all else. The Americans had done something different. They had paid the price necessary to get ashore anywhere they could, accepted horrendous casualties to secure a foothold, then advanced systematically, position by position, without obsessing over any single objective. The airfield fell not because it was directly targeted at all costs, but because the entire island defense system was being ground down. This mindset, accepting casualties for incremental, broader progress rather than a narrow objective, undermined the foundation of Japanese defensive doctrine on Tarawa. They had prepared for an enemy who would break off an attack when losses grew too high for the perceived value of the target. Instead, they faced a force willing to keep moving forward, regardless of the arithmetic. November 22nd, 1943, 0600 hours. As the third day dawned, roughly 2/3 of Betio was under Marine control. Japanese resistance had fragmented into isolated groups and pockets, cut off from each other and from any hope of reinforcement. Of the original garrison of approximately 4,500 defenders, fewer than 1,000 remained alive. Many were wounded. All were running short of ammunition. They knew there would be no rescue. Still, they fought. Every remaining pillbox, trench, and dugout had to be dealt with individually. A Japanese position that appeared silent could erupt in fire the moment Marines moved past it. Any bunker not thoroughly neutralized would rejoin the battle at the worst possible moment. The Marines adapted accordingly. Flamethrower teams advanced with assault squads as standard practice. The sequence became grim routine. Tanks or supporting fire suppressed a position. Engineers blew gaps in walls. Flamethrowers blasted jets of burning fuel into openings. Infantry followed to ensure no defenders remained. If there was any doubt, more explosives and flame were applied. By mid-morning, the fighting narrowed to Baitio's eastern tip. November 22, 1943, 1,000 hours. On the narrow eastern tail of the island, Japanese survivors had clustered into a dense complex of interconnected bunkers, trenches, and shell holes. Marine intelligence designated this final stronghold simply as the Pocket. Roughly 500 Japanese defenders occupied this area. The terrain worked in their favor. The tail of the island offered limited room for maneuver, forcing the Americans to attack along predictable approaches. The defenders used every scrap of cover, every angle, every scrap of ammunition they had left. Reducing the Pocket became a 14-hour slog through some of the most concentrated close-quarters fighting of the battle. The method, tank fire, engineers with charges, flamethrowers, infantry clearing, remained the same, but the intensity grew as the defenders fought with the desperation of men who understood they would not survive. Marines advanced at a crawl, about 20 yards per hour. That pace sounds glacial, yet compared to the bloody crawl across the lagoon and beaches on the first day, it was, in its way, faster progress. Each bunker taken meant a few more yards of ground. Each cleared trench line opened the way to the next. By nightfall on November 22nd, the Pocket had been compressed and battered into near silence. A few small groups of Japanese soldiers survived, wounded, low on ammunition, yet still unwilling to surrender. After midnight, they gathered for a final act. In the last hours before dawn, those surviving defenders launched a final banzai charge. It was a small, ragged echo of the mass charges seen in other battles, but no less dangerous to those in front of it. They rushed toward Marine positions with bayonets and grenades, shouting, trying to break through by shock. Marine machine guns and rifles cut them down. The charge disintegrated in front of the American lines. When it was over, there were no organized Japanese units left on Baitio. November 23, 1943, 13:30 hours. After 76 hours of nearly continuous combat, the island was declared secure. The numbers told a stark story. Of approximately 4,500 Japanese defenders, only 17 soldiers survived as prisoners. An additional 129 Korean laborers, forced to build the fortifications and then drag into the fighting, also lived to surrender. The Japanese garrison had suffered a casualty rate of roughly 99.7%, virtually total annihilation. American losses were staggering for such a small piece of land. About 1 to 9 Marines and 30 sailors were killed, with roughly 1,001 wounded. In just 76 hours, the 2nd Marine Division suffered more casualties than the entire Marine Corps had taken during 6 months of fighting on Guadalcanal. The division's casualty rate exceeded 17%, the highest of any American division in any Pacific battle up to that point. Yet strategically, the victory was complete. The airfield on Baitio was made operational within days, extending American air power deeper into the Central Pacific. More importantly, the battle had exposed shortcomings in American amphibious doctrine and equipment with a brutal clarity that could not be ignored. The lessons written into the coral sand at Tarawa, paid for in blood, would change how the United States waged war across the Pacific. The shock of Tarawa's casualties reverberated through American naval and marine leadership. Never before had the United States paid such a price for such a tiny piece of ground. In response, the aftermath of the battle triggered the most thorough re-examination of amphibious warfare in American history. Every phase of the operation came under scrutiny. Planners pored over photographs, reports, and survivor accounts. Every failure was identified. Every accidental success was catalogued. The first and most obvious lesson concerned naval gunfire. The 3-hour bombardment that had seemed so impressive to Marines watching from offshore had proven woefully inadequate against reinforced concrete and buried positions. The Navy acknowledged this bluntly. Future amphibious assaults would not rely on short, intense bombardments. Instead, bombardments would last days or even weeks, systematically targeting known positions with repeated strikes. Armor-piercing shells with delayed fuses would be used specifically to penetrate reinforced concrete and underground structures before exploding. Naval gunfire would shift from broad area coverage to deliberate, sustained attacks on individual point targets. Another lesson led directly to the creation of specialized units. The disaster with the tides and reef at Tarawa showed that charts and calculations were not enough. Underwater demolition teams, UDTs, the forerunners of the modern Navy SEALs, were established to conduct close reconnaissance of beaches and remove obstacles. Swimmer scouts would risk their lives ahead of the main landings to ensure commanders had real data about water depth, tides, and defenses. The value of amphibious tractors had been proven in the worst possible way. At Tarawa, the limited number of LVTs had been overwhelmed, and many had been destroyed. In the wake of the battle, production of improved models increased dramatically. New versions, like the LVT-2 Water Buffalo, incorporated armor protection and better reef crossing capability. Amphibious trucks such as the DUKW became standard equipment, further reducing the need for Marines to wade under fire. Communications equipment was redesigned with the realities of amphibious warfare in mind. Radios would be waterproofed. Redundant systems would be built into landing plans to ensure that if primary sets failed, commanders could still coordinate attacks. The experience of relying on runners under fire would not be repeated unless absolutely unavoidable. New bunker-busting munitions were developed specifically to defeat Japanese-style fortifications. Within 6 months of Tarawa, napalm would be introduced into the Pacific War as a weapon intended to clear bunkers, trenches, and jungle positions more effectively than previous incendiaries. Each of these innovations could be traced directly back to a failure or shortcoming at Tarawa. Each represented an attempt to ensure that Marines would never again have to pay the same price to overcome similar defenses. The impact of Tarawa was not limited to American doctrine. In Tokyo, the loss of the atoll sent shockwaves through Imperial General Headquarters. Japanese military planners had watched the battle unfold through reports and signals. They had believed their doctrine sound. Heavily fortified island positions, defended by garrisons prepared to fight to the death, would bleed the Americans until their will to continue eroded. The assumption was simple. A democracy that valued individual life would eventually avoid battles with such high casualty expectations. Tarawa shattered that assumption. The United States had accepted catastrophic casualties to seize a single small island with a single airfield. The Americans had not withdrawn when casualties climbed. They had not broken off the attack. They had continued until the objective was secured. If the United States would pay that price for Tarawa, what would it be willing to pay for islands closer to Japan, for positions of greater strategic significance? Japanese planners faced a grim conclusion. No individual fortress, no matter how well designed, could be guaranteed to stop an enemy willing to absorb such losses and then immediately apply the lessons learned. Defenders on other islands studied reports from Tarawa, looking for weaknesses to exploit and solutions to replicate. But those reports carried a dispiriting subtext. The Americans were learning too. They would not repeat the same mistakes. Future assaults would arrive with more firepower, more amphibious vehicles, better intelligence, and refined tactics, all born from the agony of Betio. Decades later, veterans of Tarawa found themselves struggling to explain what they had endured in those 76 hours. Many Marines who had fought across the Pacific looked back and rated Tarawa as the worst battle they experienced. Worse even than Iwo Jima, worse than Okinawa, worse than Peleliu. The reason was not simply the casualties, but the concentration of violence in such a small space and compressed time. Tarawa had been, in many ways, a laboratory of horror, a test of how much killing could be packed into a space smaller than a city park. At reunions, survivors of the 2nd Marine Division spoke of things that were hard to convey to those who had not been there. The long wade through the lagoon under relentless fire, the desperate press of bodies against the seawall, the way a single bunker could dominate hundreds of yards of beach, the systematic reduction of positions that had seemed unassailable from the water. Many returned to Betio years later. They found a peaceful tropical island, palm trees swaying, waves lapping gently against the reef. It was difficult for them to reconcile that calm with their memories of smoke, flame, and screams. Yet traces of the battle remained. Massive concrete bunkers lay half-buried, slowly being reclaimed by vegetation. In the lagoon, rusted hulks of LVTs still emerged at low tide, silent reminders of the men who had ridden them toward the shore. For the Marine Corps, Tarawa became not just a memory but a textbook. The official after-action report carried a subtitle that captured the spirit of the analysis: Lessons Written in Blood. It identified 38 major lessons, each tied to specific failures or shortcomings that had cost lives. Among the most critical, area naval bombardment could not reliably destroy hardened point targets. Future operations would require sustained, precise, direct fire on specific positions. Aerial photography, while valuable, was not enough. Human reconnaissance, including swimmer scouts, was essential. Tide calculations had to be made with worst-case scenarios in mind, and contingency plans were needed for unexpected conditions. Communications equipment needed to be fully waterproofed and backed by multiple redundant systems. Tank infantry coordination, especially in bunker reduction, was not a luxury but a requirement. Major General Julian Smith, who had commanded the 2nd Marine Division at Tarawa, added a personal observation that summarized the experience. Every mistake made on Betio, he noted, had been paid for in blood. But those sacrifices, terrible as they were, had purchased knowledge that would save lives in future operations. Within weeks of the island's capture, Tarawa's strategic value began to show. B-24 Liberator bombers, operating from the rebuilt airfield, struck Japanese positions throughout the Marshall Islands, softening them for future invasions. Photo-reconnaissance flights from Betio gathered intelligence that proved crucial for planning the next steps of the Pacific campaign. Yet Tarawa's greatest impact was psychological. It sent a message to friend and foe alike. No position, however fortified, would be allowed to halt the American advance if the United States judged the objective necessary. The battle undermined Japanese morale, even as it hardened American resolve. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, would later describe Tarawa as a turning point, not because of the territory gained, but because of what it demonstrated about American adaptability and will. The road to Tokyo was not yet short or easy, but Tarawa proved that the path existed, and that the United States had the resolve to follow it, regardless of the cost. 3 months after Tarawa, that resolve and those hard-won lessons were put to the test in the Marshall Islands. At Kwajalein Atoll, a position more heavily defended than Betio, Marines went ashore under a very different set of conditions. Prolonged naval bombardment with armor-piercing shells had systematically pounded Japanese positions. Underwater demolition teams had reconnoitered the reefs and beaches, clearing obstacles and providing accurate reports on depth and defenses. Amphibious tractors were available in abundance, carrying Marines over reefs that had trapped Higgins boats at Tarawa. Flamethrowers arrived with the first waves, ready to deal with bunkers from the outset. Tank infantry coordination had been rehearsed and refined. The result was dramatic. Kwajalein, despite its stronger defenses, fell with roughly 1/5 of the casualties suffered at Tarawa. On Eniwetok, another fortified island in the Marshalls, American losses were also significantly lower than those on Betio. The connection was direct. Every improvement, accurate reconnaissance, sufficient amphibious vehicles, proper bombardment, integrated armor and infantry, early availability of flamethrowers, could be traced back to specific failures at Tarawa. The blood spilled on that small island had literally purchased a transformation in American amphibious warfare. Behind statistics and doctrinal diagrams, Tarawa's true cost rested on individual lives. 4 Marines received the Medal of Honor for their actions in the battle. 3 of them, Hawkins, Bonnion, and Borderon, died earning it, killed while attacking enemy positions that had seemed impregnable. Only Colonel David Shoup survived to wear his medal. He would later become the 22nd Commandant of the Marine Corps, carrying the memory of Betio with him into the post-war service. Thousands of others suffered wounds, physical, mental, or both, that would remain with them for the rest of their lives. The compressed violence of Tarawa left emotional scars that the language and medical understanding of the time struggled to describe. What would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder affected countless veterans who returned home, changed by those 76 hours. The Japanese defenders, for their part, had fought with a level of courage and commitment that even their enemies acknowledged. They obeyed orders to hold their ground and die rather than surrender, fighting to nearly the last man. Only 17 Japanese soldiers and 1 officer survived from the entire garrison. The Korean laborers who lived through the battle represented another, often overlooked, aspect of Tarawa's tragedy. Forced to build the island's fortifications, then forced again to fight in the final stages of the battle, they were victims of a war not of their choosing. Their survival rate was somewhat higher than that of the Japanese garrison, in part because some were able to surrender once Japanese control collapsed and American forces reached their positions. In the years that followed, Tarawa became required study in military academies around the world, not because the battle showcased flawless tactics, but because it illustrated something deeper. The Japanese had created what may have been the closest thing to a perfect defensive system that could be built on a tiny coral island with the materials available. They had combined engineering skill, careful planning, and unyielding discipline. In purely tactical terms, Tarawa represented an apex of island fortification. The Americans took it anyway. Modern doctrine still draws lessons from what happened on Betio. The critical importance of accurate intelligence, the need for equipment tailored to specific environments, the vital role of joint operations that combine naval, air, and ground power, and above all, the recognition that human will can overturn even the most intimidating tactical disadvantages. The establishment of modern special operations forces, the emphasis on detailed reconnaissance before major operations, the development of precision weapons capable of neutralizing hardened targets, and the doctrine of overwhelming force at points of attack all carry echoes of those 76 hours on Tarawa. The battle proved that no position is truly impregnable if the attacker is both determined and willing to accept the cost. Admiral Shibazaki's prediction that it would take 1,000,000 men 100 years to conquer Tarawa has become one of history's most dramatically wrong military boasts. In reality, it took about 18,000 Marines 76 hours. The arithmetic of the battle was brutal. Roughly 3,000 American casualties to eliminate about 4,500 Japanese defenders and seize a single small island with 1 airfield. Judged strictly by tactical ratios, those numbers might appear unacceptable. But wars are not decided solely by ratios. They are decided by will, by what a nation is prepared to endure and what it is determined to achieve. Tarawa demonstrated that the United States, despite being a democracy that cherished individual life, would accept grievous losses to achieve strategic goals. Japanese planners, who had counted on American sensitivity to casualties as a strategic weakness, learned that Americans, when convinced of the justice and necessity of their cause, would absorb the cost. Tarawa stands today as one of the most important battles in American military history, not because of the territory gained, but because of what was learned and what was revealed. The transformation of amphibious doctrine, the proof of American resolve to allies and adversaries, and the demonstration that no island in the Pacific could be made safe by fortifications alone if the United States decided it must be taken. The courage displayed by the Marines on Betio, the men who waded hundreds of yards through water under heavy fire, who clung to the thin shelter of the seawall, who assaulted entrenched positions over and over when logic suggested retreat, became part of Marine Corps legend. Their sacrifice bought more than a victory on Tarawa. It bought knowledge that would save thousands of lives on beaches yet to be named. Years later, Colonel David Shoup captured the essence of the battle with a simple comparison. Shibazaki, he recalled, had said that 1 million Americans could not take Tarawa in 100 years. He was wrong. It took 18,000 Marines 76 hours. The difference lay in what each side measured. Shibazaki measured strength in concrete and steel, in width of bunker walls and thickness of coconut logs. The Marines measured it in determination. The final lesson of Tarawa reaches beyond military strategy. It shows that human will can surmount apparently impossible obstacles, that people who value freedom will make extraordinary sacrifices when they believe they must, and that no tyranny, no matter how well fortified, can remain secure against free men determined to prevail. In the 76 hours between the first shell splashing into Betio's shore and the declaration that the island was secure, the Marines of the 2nd Division did more than take an airfield. They transformed the impossible into the inevitable. On a tiny coral island in the Central Pacific, they wrote one of the most intense and costly chapters in American military history, paid for in blood on the sands of Tarawa.